Welcome. For the next while, there's nothing you need to solve, fix, or figure out. Just settle in somewhere comfortable, let your body relax, and allow your thoughts to slow down. You can close your eyes whenever you're ready. There's no rush, and nothing you need to keep track of. Just follow the story as it drifts by, like something you're only half remembering. Tonight, we'll travel through a galaxy far, far away, through ancient worlds, rising legends, and quiet moments between wars. You don't need to focus too hard or hold onto every detail. If your mind wanders, that's fine. Just come back to the sound of the story whenever you feel like it. Let everything else wait until tomorrow. And now we begin. Chapter 1: The Dawn on Tython. Long before the galaxy was mapped, before ships traced glowing lines through hyperspace, before the names Jedi and Sith carried the weight of legend and fear, there was only a distant world, quiet and waiting beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars. There are moments in history when a single choice seems to change everything. And then there are moments when no single choice can be blamed at all, when countless small fractures, left unattended, finally give way all at once. The Force Wars were not ignited by one act. They were the inevitable result of everything that had come before. At first, there was no declaration, no gathering of armies, no formal lines drawn across the land. The Jedi did not wake one morning and decide to wage war against themselves. Instead, they simply stopped standing together. Where once there had been unity, there was now separation. Where there had been shared purpose, there were now competing visions of truth. The temples of Tython, those ancient centers of learning and balance, became something else entirely. They became strongholds. Some temples remained devoted to the teachings of balance, though even among them there was growing tension. Many had begun to lean more heavily toward the ashlar, believing that restraint and discipline were the only way to prevent further catastrophe. Others changed more dramatically. In these places, the Bogan was no longer treated as something to temper or understand. It was embraced, explored, pushed further than it ever had been before. The Jedi who gathered there did not see themselves as corrupted. They saw themselves as unbound. Tython felt the change immediately. The Force, once a flowing current across the planet, became turbulent, like a river split into opposing tides. Regions of the world began to reflect the philosophies of those who inhabited them. In lands where the ashlar dominated, there was stillness, a quiet, almost fragile calm, as though the world itself were holding its breath. In lands where the Bogan flourished, the air seemed sharper, charged, alive with energy that flickered unpredictably, like a storm that never quite broke, but never fully passed. And between these regions, the tension grew. The first true clash came not from strategy, but from inevitability. A group of Jedi aligned with ashlar teachings had been sent to observe one of the Bogan-leaning temples, not to confront, at least not officially, but to understand, to assess whether the growing imbalance could still be corrected without force. They did not go as soldiers, but they did not return as observers. No one knows exactly what was said when the two groups met. Some accounts speak of attempted diplomacy, of calm voices and careful words. Others suggest that the confrontation was tense from the beginning, that neither side truly believed the other could be reasoned with. What is known is how it ended. The Force erupted, not in a storm across the sky, but in a focused, violent surge between individuals who had once called each other allies. Power met power, control clashed with intensity. The air itself seemed to fracture under the strain. When it was over, there were survivors. But there was no peace. Word spread quickly, not through formal channels, but through whispers, through witnesses, through the undeniable shift that followed. For the first time, Jedi had turned their abilities fully against one another. Not in training, not in discipline, but in conflict. And something fundamental had changed. After that, the clashes became more frequent. Still unorganized, still chaotic, but no longer isolated. Groups began to travel not for learning, but for confrontation. Temples fortified themselves, not with walls of stone, but with preparation, with vigilance, with the quiet understanding that they might soon be tested. The idea of neutrality began to fade. To stand between Ashla and Bogan was no longer seen as balance. It was seen as a weakness. For those who had once believed most strongly in the Jedi philosophy, this was the hardest truth to accept. Balance had been their foundation, their guiding principle, the belief that had allowed them to live, to learn, to grow without falling into the extremes that now defined their world. But balance required participation from both sides. And one side no longer wanted it. The Jedi Council, if it could still be called that, struggled to respond. They called for unity, for restraint, for a return to the teachings that had once guided them. Messengers were sent, gatherings were proposed, appeals were made not to power, but to memory, to the shared past that had once bound them together. But memory was no longer enough. Too much had changed. Among those who followed the Bogan, a new philosophy had begun to take shape. It was no longer just about questioning balance. It was about rejecting it. They spoke of freedom, not as chaos, but as truth. The idea that the Force was not meant to be restrained, divided, or controlled, that it was something to be experienced fully, without limitation. Emotion was not a weakness. It was clarity. Power was not something to fear. It was something to claim. To them, the Jedi teachings had been incomplete, an early attempt to understand something far greater than they had realized. And now, at last, they believed they were beginning to see the Force as it truly was. Unbounded. Those who remained committed to balance, or who had begun to lean toward the Ashla, saw something very different. They saw the cost. They saw how the planet itself was suffering, how the storms had grown stronger, more destructive, how regions of Tython were becoming unstable, reshaped again and again by forces that no longer seemed connected to harmony at all. They saw the toll it took on individuals, how those who embraced the Bogan too fully became different, not monstrous, not in any simple sense, but altered, driven, consumed by a need for more power, more understanding, more control. And they feared where that path would lead. The war, when it finally took shape, was not fought with armies in the traditional sense. There were no ranks, no formations, no banners carried across the battlefield. There was only the Force, wielded by those who understood it in fundamentally different ways. Battles were unpredictable. They could erupt anywhere, on open plains, within temple grounds, across jagged mountain ranges where the Force itself seemed to echo more strongly. The environment was never separate from the conflict. It responded, amplified, and sometimes overwhelmed those who fought within it. A single confrontation could reshape the land. A moment of uncontrolled power could trigger a storm that lasted for days. The line between combatant and world blurred. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, patterns began to form. Those aligned with Ashla teachings, though still calling themselves Jedi, began to fight with increasing discipline. They relied on control, on coordination, on the ability to remain centered even in the midst of conflict. They protected one another. They adapted. And slowly, they began to change. The idea of balance, while not abandoned, became more focused, more redefined. They leaned toward the Ashla not because they believed the Bogan had no place, but because they had seen what happened when it was left unchecked. Their path narrowed, but it strengthened. Those who embraced the Bogan evolved as well. Their approach to conflict was different, less structured, but no less effective. They drew upon emotion, upon intensity, upon the raw, immediate connection to the Force that had always defined their philosophy. They were unpredictable. powerful, and often overwhelming. They did not seek to preserve what had been. They sought to transcend it. Between these two paths, the possibility of reconciliation faded. Not because it was impossible, but because fewer and fewer believed it was worth pursuing. Each clash deepened the divide. Each loss hardened resolve. Each victory, no matter how small, reinforced the belief that one side must ultimately prevail. Tython, caught between them, began to suffer in ways it never had before. Entire regions became uninhabitable, scarred by repeated surges of force energy. The storms, once reactions, now seemed almost constant in some areas, an ever-present reminder of the imbalance that had taken hold. The world that had once brought the Jedi together was now being torn apart by them. And still, the war continued. Not as a single, decisive conflict, but as a series of encounters, each one shaping what came next. There was no clear beginning, no single turning point, only a gradual escalation that carried them further and further from what they had once been. The Jedi were becoming something else. Something more defined, more divided. In time, new names would emerge. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, as identities shifted and philosophies solidified, the language began to change. Those who followed the path of discipline, selflessness, and the guiding light of the Force would come to be known as the Jedi. Those who embraced power, passion, and the unrestrained intensity of the dark would become something far more dangerous. The Tython. But in these early days, those names were still forming, still uncertain. Like everything else in a world caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. And so the Force wars raged on, not just as a battle for survival, but as a struggle to define the very nature of the Force itself. That world was Tython. If one could stand upon its surface in those earliest days, before history had learned to speak its name, they would not find peace in the way one might imagine. Tython was not gentle, nor was it forgiving. Its skies shimmered with strange energy, and its winds whispered through ancient stone like voices that had never belonged to any living being. The land itself seemed to breathe, subtly shifting, alive in ways that defied ordinary understanding. And always there was the Force. Not as a concept, not as a philosophy, but as something immediate and undeniable, woven into every leaf, every current of air, every flicker of light along the horizon. It pulsed quietly, like a heartbeat beneath the world, sometimes calm and sometimes not. No one truly remembers how the first settlers came to Tython. Some say they were guided by dreams, visions shared across star systems, calling them toward a place they did not yet understand. Others believe they were drawn by ancient technology, relics of a forgotten civilization that had long since vanished. There are even stories that suggest the Force itself reached outward, gathering those who could feel it, pulling them across the void like threads drawn into a single tapestry. Whatever the truth may be, they arrived. They came in small numbers at first, isolated groups scattered across the planet. Humans, Twi'leks, Zabraks, and others whose names have faded into obscurity. They did not arrive as a unified people. They brought with them their own languages, their own customs, their own fears. And yet, almost immediately, they shared something deeper. They could feel it. At first it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of perception, a sense that the world around them was listening. Some noticed how their instincts sharpened in moments of danger, how their movements seemed guided by something unseen. Others experienced dreams, vivid, strange, and often unsettling, filled with symbols they could not explain. But it did not remain subtle for long. Tython revealed itself quickly and without mercy. Storms unlike anything they had ever known would roll across the land without warning. The sky would darken, not with clouds, but with energy, crackling, luminous, alive. The ground would tremble as though the planet itself was shifting in discomfort. Trees would bend, rivers would surge, and the very air would hum with a force that felt both external and deeply personal. These were not ordinary storms. They were force storms. At first, the settlers had no words for them, only fear. They sought shelter, clung to one another, and tried to survive events that seemed to defy all natural law. But slowly, gradually, they began to notice something strange. The storms were not random. There were patterns. Moments before a storm, tension would rise among the settlers, arguments would flare, fear would spread, anger would take hold, and then, as if in response, the world itself would erupt. It was not immediate understanding that led them forward, but curiosity. Among the settlers were thinkers, observers, individuals who chose not to turn away from what frightened them, but to study it. They began to record what they experienced. They compared stories. They searched for meaning in the chaos. And over time, a realization began to take shape. The Force was not just something they could feel. It was something they could influence. This idea did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, like dawn breaking across a dark horizon. A healer might notice that calm focus seemed to ease another's pain. A hunter might find their movements guided with uncanny precision when they trusted their instincts. A child, reaching out in fear, might move something without touching it and not understand how. Each moment, taken alone, could be dismissed. But together, they formed something undeniable. The settlers were not merely living on Tython. They were part of it. As this understanding grew, so too did their willingness to explore it. Small groups formed, individuals drawn together by shared experiences and questions. They would gather in quiet places, away from the chaos of daily survival, and attempt to focus on the Force. At first, their efforts were clumsy, unrefined. They lacked structure, guidance, or any real sense of what they were doing. But even in those early attempts, something remarkable began to happen. They learned to listen. Not with their ears, but with something deeper. They began to sense the subtle currents that flowed through the world, the rise and fall of energy, the way it shifted and responded. They learned that emotion played a role, that intention mattered. Calm brought clarity. Fear brought distortion. And anger brought power, but at a cost they did not yet fully understand. It was during this time that the earliest foundations of what would become the Jedi Order began to form. Not as an institution, not yet, but as an idea. A shared belief that the Force was something to be studied, understood, and perhaps balanced. They began to speak of two aspects they had observed: the Ashlar and the Bogan. The Ashlar was the Force as they experienced it in moments of peace. It was the quiet guidance that came when the mind was still, the sense of connection that bound them not only to each other, but to the world itself. It felt expansive, harmonious, like standing in sunlight after a long night. The Bogan, by contrast, was something sharper, more immediate. It surged in moments of intense emotion, anger, fear, desire. It could be intoxicating, offering strength and clarity in ways that felt powerful but unstable, like a flame that burned too brightly to control. Neither aspect was entirely separate from the other. Both were part of the same greater whole. And this, more than anything else, defined the early philosophy of the Jedi. They did not believe one was good and the other evil. They believed both were necessary. Balance, they reasoned, was not the absence of one side, but the harmony between them. It was a delicate idea, difficult to practice, even more difficult to maintain, but for a time it worked. As their understanding deepened, the settlers began to organize themselves more formally. They established places of learning, simple at first, little more than gathering points marked by stone or natural formations that seemed to resonate strongly with the Force. These would eventually become the temples of Tython. Within them, the early Jedi trained not only their connection to the Force, but their minds and bodies as well. They studied philosophy, learning to question themselves as much as the world around them. They practiced forms of combat, not out of aggression, but as a means of discipline and control. They observed nature, seeking to understand how balance existed in ecosystems in cycles of growth and decay. Everything, they believed, was connected, and everything required balance. Yet even in those early days, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible at first, that balance was not as simple as they had hoped. For some, the pull of the Bogan was stronger, not necessarily because they were cruel or malicious, but because they were curious. The Bogan offered something immediate, something tangible. Where the Ashlar required patience and stillness, the Bogan responded quickly, powerfully, to emotion and intent. It was easier, and that made it dangerous. At first, the Jedi addressed this imbalance with understanding. Those who leaned too heavily toward one aspect of the Force were guided gently back toward the center. They were encouraged to reflect, to explore the opposite side, to restore harmony within themselves. But as their numbers grew, so too did the challenge. Balance, it seemed, was not a destination. It was a constant struggle. And Tython, ever responsive, continued to remind them of that truth. Chapter 2, The Gathering Storm. If Tython had once known something close to peace, it did not last. Balance, as the Jedi had come to understand it, was never something that could simply be achieved and held. It was not a still point, not a final state of harmony. It was motion, constant, shifting, delicate, and like all things that require careful tending, it could be lost. At first, the changes were subtle. A disagreement here, a failed meditation there, a student who lingered too long in the intensity of their emotions, reluctant to return to stillness. None of it seemed significant on its own. The Jedi had always struggled with balance. That struggle, after all, was part of their identity. But Tython noticed. It always did. The storms returned, not all at once, not in the overwhelming fury of the earliest days, but in quiet reminders. A tremor beneath the ground that lasted just a moment too long. A sudden shift in the wind that carried with it a strange, unsettled feeling. A flicker of energy in the sky, like distant lightning with no storm to follow. The Jedi observed these signs with concern. They recorded them as they had always done. They compared them, they searched for patterns. And slowly, uneasily, they began to see one. The disturbances in the world were growing more frequent, and so were the disturbances within themselves. Within the temples of Tython, training had become more structured over time. What had once been scattered gatherings of curious minds had evolved into a disciplined, though still flexible, system of learning. Masters guided students. Knowledge was preserved and shared. Rituals and practices helped maintain focus and unity. But structure, while useful, also revealed differences more clearly. Some students excelled in stillness. They found comfort in the Ashlar, in quiet reflection and patient understanding. Their connection to the Force was steady, like a calm river, deep, consistent, and reliable. Others struggled with that stillness. They felt the Force more intensely in moments of emotion. When they were pushed, challenged, or even angered, their abilities sharpened, their senses heightened. The world seemed clearer, faster, more immediate. They did not see this as imbalance. They saw it as truth. Among these individuals, conversations began to shift. At first, they were private, small discussions held at the edges of training grounds or in the dim quiet of temple corridors. Questions that were not meant to challenge openly, but could not be ignored. Why must power be restrained? Why should emotion be treated as something to overcome, rather than something to embrace? If the Bogan was part of the Force, then why fear it? These questions did not have simple answers. And the more they were asked, the more difficult it became to maintain the unity the Jedi had once taken for granted. The Masters of the Jedi Order were not unaware of this shift. They had seen it before in smaller ways. Individual students who struggled with balance, who leaned too far in one direction or the other. The solution had always been the same: guidance, correction, and if necessary, pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was one of the oldest practices of the Jedi. When an individual drifted too far toward the Ashlar or the Bogan, they were sent to the opposite side of Tython, regions where the Force itself resonated more strongly with the aspect they lacked. There, removed from the familiarity of their training and surrounded by a different energy, they were expected to confront themselves. To listen. To change. For many, it worked. The journey was difficult, often isolating, but it brought clarity. Those who returned spoke of renewed understanding, of a deeper connection to balance. The system, imperfect as it was, had sustained the order for generations. But now something was different. More and more Jedi were being sent on pilgrimage. And not all of them returned unchanged. Some came back quieter, more withdrawn. Others returned with a certainty that unsettled their masters, not a renewed sense of balance, but a conviction that what they had experienced was not something to be corrected. It was something to be embraced. One such individual, though history would give many names to figures like them, stood at the center of this growing shift. They had once been considered a promising student, focused, intelligent, deeply connected to the Force, but where others found peace in the Ashlar, they found it incomplete. There was something missing. During training, they excelled when pushed to their limits. In moments of stress or conflict, their abilities surged beyond those of their peers. They moved faster, thought more clearly, acted with a precision that bordered on instinct. Their masters praised their skill, but questioned its source. When they were eventually sent on pilgrimage, it was not as punishment, but as guidance. A chance, it was believed, to restore balance, to temper intensity with stillness. They were sent to a region strong with Ashlar energy. And for a time, they tried. They meditated, they listened, they followed the teachings as they had been instructed, but the stillness did not bring clarity. It brought frustration, a sense of limitation, as though they were being asked to dim a part of themselves that was not wrong, but powerful. When they returned, something had changed. Not in a way that could be easily measured, but in the way they carried themselves, in the certainty of their words, in the quiet defiance that lingered beneath every conversation. They no longer sought balance. They sought understanding on their own terms. And they were not alone. As more Jedi began to question the Order's teachings, those private conversations grew louder. What had once been whispered became debated. What had once been questioned became argued. The temples of Tython, once places of quiet learning, began to feel different. Not hostile, not yet, but divided. Groups formed, not officially, not with names or declarations, but with shared beliefs. Some held firmly to the traditional philosophy of balance, believing that the Ashlar and Bogan must remain in harmony, carefully managed and respected. Others began to shift away from that idea. They argued that balance, as it was being taught, was not true balance at all, that it favored restraint over growth, caution over potential. They did not deny the dangers of the Bogan, but they believed those dangers came not from the Bogan itself, but from a lack of understanding. To them, the solution was not avoidance. It was mastery. Tython responded. The storms returned in full. No longer subtle, no longer distant, they swept across the planet with a force that could not be ignored. The skies burned with energy. The ground split open in places long thought stable. Entire regions became unrecognizable in the wake of these events. And once again, the pattern was clear. The more divided the Jedi became, the more violent the world grew. It was no longer possible to dismiss the connection. The Force was reacting. Faced with this growing instability, the leaders of the Jedi Order made a decision. For the first time, they would impose stricter guidance. Training would be more controlled, practices more clearly defined. Those who showed signs of imbalance would be addressed more quickly, more firmly. Pilgrimages would be enforced without delay, and those who resisted would not be permitted to continue their studies. It was not a decision made lightly, but it was one born of necessity, or so they believed. For some, this brought reassurance, a sense that the Order was taking action, that the growing unrest could be contained. For others, it confirmed their fears. The Jedi were no longer simply guiding. They were controlling, and control, to those who had begun to embrace the intensity of the Bogan, felt like a betrayal of everything they had come to understand. The divide deepened. It did not begin with war. It never does. It began with distance. Students who once trained together now avoided one another. Conversations became arguments, arguments became silence, and silence became something heavier. Distrust. Small incidents began to occur. A training exercise that went too far, a disagreement that turned physical, a moment of anger that resulted in more damage than intended. Each event, on its own, could be explained. But together, they told a different story. The Jedi were no longer united. And then, one day, something happened that could not be dismissed. A confrontation, details lost to time, preserved only in fragments, erupted between two groups within one of the temples. What began as a disagreement over teachings escalated, fueled by emotion, pride, and a growing refusal to yield. The Force responded violently. When it was over, parts of the temple lay in ruin. The air itself seemed scorched, heavy with lingering energy. Those who witnessed it would later struggle to describe exactly what had happened, only that it felt as though the Force had been torn, pulled in opposing directions with devastating patinam ain. For the first time, the conflict had left lasting scars. Not just on Tython, but on the Jedi themselves. In the aftermath, there could be no more denial. The Order stood at the edge of something irreversible. What had once been a shared path was now splitting, slowly but surely, into two. One that sought harmony through discipline, restraint, and unity, and another that sought truth through power, emotion, and freedom. Neither side believed themselves to be wrong. And that was the most dangerous truth of all. The Force Wars had not yet begun, but the storm that would become them was already here. Chapter 4, The Sundering of Tython. There comes a moment in every great conflict when the question is no longer whether things can return to what they once were, but whether they ever truly could have. For the Jedi of Tython, that moment arrived not in a single battle, nor in a single decision, but in the quiet realization that followed years of war. They were no longer what they had been, and no amount of remembrance, no appeal to tradition or shared origin could change that. The Force Wars had reshaped everything. Tython itself bore the scars, vast regions altered beyond recognition, landscapes twisted by energies that had been unleashed again and again. Once stable grounds had become volatile. Skies that had once shimmered with quiet power now cracked with constant unrest. The planet was no longer reacting. It was suffering, and the Jedi, those who remained, could feel it. Among the Ashlar-aligned practitioners, a shift began to take hold, not one born of anger, but of clarity. For generations, they had believed in balance as the central truth of the Force. They had taught that Ashlar and Bogan were two halves of a whole, each necessary, each deserving of understanding. But the war had shown them something difficult to accept. Balance, as they had practiced it, required restraint from both sides. And one side had chosen not to restrain itself. This realization did not come easily. Many resisted it. They clung to the old teachings, to the hope that reconciliation was still possible, that those who had embraced the Bogan could yet return, not through force, but through understanding. But time and conflict and loss wore that hope away. Too many had fallen. Too much had been destroyed. And the storms had not ceased. It was then that the leaders of the Ashlar-aligned Jedi gathered. Not in a grand temple untouched by war, but in a place that bore the marks of everything they had endured. Cracked stone, open sky, the quiet echo of energy that had not yet faded. There they spoke not as teachers and students, but as survivors. They spoke of what had been lost, of what could still be saved, and of what must be done. The decision they reached would shape the future of the galaxy. They would no longer follow the path of balance as it had been taught. They would choose the Ashlar, not as one half of a whole, but as the foundation of a new way forward. This was not, to them, a rejection of truth. It was an adaptation to reality. They had seen what came of unrestrained power, of emotion left unchecked. They had witnessed how easily the Bogan could consume those who sought to master it, and they had felt the way Tython itself responded to that imbalance. To preserve life, to restore stability, to prevent further destruction. They believed they had no other choice. And so the Jedi Order ended. In its place, something new began. The Jedi Order. The transformation was not merely in name. It was in philosophy, in purpose, in identity. Where the Jedi had sought balance, the Jedi would seek harmony through discipline. Where the Jedi had explored both light and dark, the Jedi would commit themselves to the light, guided by selflessness, restraint, and a deep respect for the Force as something not to be dominated, but followed. Emotion would not be denied, but it would be controlled. Power would not be rejected, but it would be used carefully. For many, this change brought a sense of peace, a direction at last, after years of uncertainty. But not all accepted it. Those who had embraced the Bogan saw the decision for what it was. A rejection, not just of their methods, but of their very understanding of the Force. To them, the new Jedi were not protectors of balance. They were deniers of truth. The divide, once philosophical, had now become absolute. There could be no middle ground, no shared path, only opposition. The final conflict on Tython was not the largest battle of the Force Wars, but it was the most decisive. It came not as a chaotic clash, but as a deliberate confrontation, both sides aware, at last, that the war could not continue as it had. The Jedi sought an end. The Bogan-aligned sought victory. The battle itself would be remembered in fragments, stories passed down, altered with time, shaped by those who told them. But all accounts agree on one thing. The Force surged that day with a power unlike anything before. The Jedi fought with unity, not as individuals seeking dominance, but as a collective guided by shared purpose. Their connection to the Ashlar allowed them to move together, to anticipate, to protect. They did not seek to overwhelm, but to endure, to stabilize, to hold. Their strength was not in raw power, but in control. Their opponents fought differently. They drew deeply from the Bogan, from emotion, from intensity that burned bright and fierce. Their power was immediate, devastating, unpredictable. Where the Jedi moved like a flowing current, they struck like lightning, sudden, overwhelming, and often uncontrollable. They did not seek balance. They sought to break it. Tython could not contain the conflict. The land trembled, the sky split with energy. Storms erupted not across the horizon, but directly within the battlefield, as though the planet itself could no longer endure what was happening upon its surface. It was not just a battle. It was a breaking point. And when it ended, neither side had truly won. The Jedi stood, but at great cost. Their victory was not one of triumph, but of survival. They had held the line. They had endured, and they had made their choice clear. Those who had followed the Bogan did not fall. Not entirely, but they were defeated. driven back, scattered, broken as a unified force. And for the first time since the conflict had begun, they were no longer in control of their future. The Jedi faced a decision, one that would define not only their order, but the fate of their enemies. They could not allow the war to continue. Tython could not survive it. And yet, they could not simply destroy those who had opposed them. They were, after all, once Jedi. Once brothers, sisters, allies. So they chose exile. It was not an act of mercy alone, nor was it purely punishment. It was necessity. Those who refused to abandon the Bogan, who would not accept the path of the Jedi, were gathered, separated, and forced from Tython. Removed from the world they had helped shape. Sent into the unknown. There was no ceremony, no farewell worthy of what had been lost. Only departure. Ships ancient even then, guided more by instinct and the Force than by precise navigation, carried them away from Tython, out into the vastness of the galaxy. To destinations none of them could truly predict. To futures none of them could yet see. The Jedi remained, on a world forever changed. In the quiet that followed, Tython began slowly, painfully to stabilize. The storms lessened. The land settled. The Force, though still scarred, began to flow more gently once again. But the galaxy had already been set upon a new path. Those who had been exiled did not disappear. They endured. They adapted. And in time, they would become something more than what they had been. No longer Jedi. No longer simply followers of the Bogan. But a new order. One that would embrace the dark not as imbalance, but as identity. The Sith. And though Tython would remember the end of the Force Wars as a moment of resolution, it was, in truth, only the beginning. Chapter 5, Echoes Across the Stars. Time in the galaxy does not move like a straight line. It moves like waves. What is buried in one age rises again in another. What is lost is never truly gone. And what is begun in silence can echo so loudly that entire civilizations believe it to be destiny. So it was with the Jedi. So it was with the Jedi. And so it would be with the Sith. After the exile, Tython did not vanish from history. It became something quieter. A world of memory. The birthplace of a philosophy that had once tried to hold the Force in perfect balance, and had instead split the galaxy into opposing truths. The Jedi remained there for a time. They rebuilt what had been broken, not into what it once was, but into something more controlled, more stable, more deliberate. Their temples were restored, though not as monuments to balance between Ashla and Bogan, but as places of discipline, learning, and restraint. They did not forget what had happened, but they chose to define themselves by what came after it. The Jedi Order, as it now existed, spread outward. Slowly at first. Not as conquerors, but as travelers. They moved beyond Tython, beyond the deep core, into the wider galaxy. And with them, they carried the philosophy forged in the aftermath of war. That the Force was best understood through peace. That attachment led to suffering. That emotion, while natural, must be guided rather than followed. And that balance was not found in equal indulgence of light and dark, but in the careful rejection of the dark's pull. But the galaxy is never still, and neither is the Force. Far from Tython, in regions unrecorded by Jedi archives for many generations, the exiled Jedi who had embraced the Bogan arrived in a different kind of silence. They were not a united order anymore. They were survivors, refugees of ideology, exiles not only from a world, but from a belief system that had once defined them. At first, they struggled. The philosophies they had brought with them had been shaped on Tython, on a world where the Force was overwhelming, immediate, and ever-present. In the wider galaxy, that connection felt different, distant, fragmented. Some broke from what they had been taught entirely. Others clung to it more fiercely than ever. And in that tension, something new was born. They discovered worlds rich in dark side energy, places where fear, ambition, and power had left deep impressions in the fabric of the Force. On one such world, they found a society that would change them forever. A species sensitive to the dark side, strong in its influence, steeped in ritual and dominance. The Sith. The Sith were not yet what later ages would fear. They were not an empire. They were not a galactic threat. They were a people. But to the exiled Jedi, they represented something profound. A mirror. A confirmation that the Bogan was not a mistake, nor a corruption, but a force that could shape entire civilizations. And so, over time, the two became intertwined. Jedi exiles and Sith natives merged in philosophy, then in culture, then in identity. And the name Sith began to take on a new meaning. Not just a species, not just a world, but an ideology. While this transformation occurred in the dark corners of the galaxy, the Jedi Order continued to grow. And as it grew, it changed. Distance from Tython softened memory. Generations passed. Stories of the Force Wars became less about lived experience and more about teaching tools, lessons to be interpreted, not warnings to be remembered firsthand. The Jedi Code began to formalize. Emotion leads to suffering. Attachment leads to loss. Ignorance leads to fear. These were not merely philosophical ideas anymore. They became doctrine. And somewhere beneath all of it, the original truth of the Jedi began to fade. Not disappear, but blur. The idea that the Force had once been viewed as Ashla and Bogan together, two halves of a single living current, became something scholars debated rather than something practitioners remembered. To some Jedi, it was a cautionary tale. To others, a misconception overcome by progress. But to the Force itself, nothing had been resolved. Only changed. Centuries passed. Then millennia. And the galaxy entered cycles of rise and fall, unity and fragmentation, war and fragile peace. And in every age, the shadow of what had begun on Tython returned in new forms. There was Revan, a Jedi who became something else entirely in the crucible of war. He did not simply fall to darkness. He studied it, wielded it, and returned transformed, carrying within him both philosophies in conflict, much like the Jedi of old, though without their gidding structure of balance. Revan's story became one of the clearest echoes of the ancient divide. Not Jedi versus Sith, but control versus passion, light versus dark, Ashla versus Bogan, reborn in a new age with new names. There were others. The Jedi Civil War, the rise and fall of Sith empires, the rule of two, conceived not as balance, but as survival, two individuals embodying an ideology that refused to be extinguished. Always the pattern repeated. A push toward control. A push toward freedom. A collapse. A rebirth. And always the Force responded. Subtly. Silently. Like Tython's storms long ago. In time, even the Jedi would forget the Jedi in full. But the galaxy never truly lost them. Because every conflict between Jedi and Sith was, in truth, a continuation of their earliest struggle. Not a war between good and evil, but a philosophical fracture that had never fully healed. The Jedi believed in peace through discipline. The Sith believed in strength through passion. and both, in their own way, reached toward understanding something neither could fully define. The Force. And if one were to look far enough back, past the temples of Coruscant, past the Sith temples of Korriban, past the great wars and fallen empires and shattered alliances, they would find a quiet world in the deep core. A world called Tython, where it all began, where beings once tried to live between extremes, where balance was not yet heresy or doctrine, but a living, breathing attempt to understand the universe itself. And perhaps the greatest truth of all is this: the Jedi did not fail because they sought balance. They failed because balance is not something that can be held still. It must be lived. And the galaxy, vast as it is, does not remain still for long. So the story continues, not as a beginning, not as an end, but as an echo passing through generations, reshaping itself each time it is told. The Jedi and the Sith, light and dark, order and passion, Ashlar and Bogan, different names, same current, same force. And somewhere in the quiet between stars, Tython still remembers, Epilogue, the quiet beneath the Force. In the end, history rarely announces its most important truths. There are no thunderclaps when an age truly ends, no celestial sign that something foundational has shifted. The galaxy continues to turn, stars continue to burn, and civilizations continue to rise believing they are the first to understand the universe as it truly is. But beneath all of it, beneath empires, beneath wars, beneath names that echo across centuries, something older remains. Something patient. Something unchanged. The Force. On Tython, time did not feel the same as it did elsewhere in the galaxy. Even long after the Force Wars had ended, even after the Jedi had left the world behind to spread into the stars, even after the memory of the Jedi had become a subject of fragmented holocrons and half-remembered teachings, Tython remained different. Quiet but not empty. Still but not lifeless. It was a world that remembered everything, even when no one else did. The Jedi would come to call it a mythic place, a birthplace, a symbol more than a location. Few among them ever returned, and those who did spoke of it carefully, as though raising their voices too loudly might disturb something buried deep beneath the planet's surface. They described ruins, broken temples half consumed by time, stone structures aligned not with cities or civilizations, but with something older, something that seemed to follow the invisible currents of the Force itself. And always they spoke of the same sensation. Not peace, not conflict, but balance, watching. The Sith, too, carried fragments of Tython in their legacy, though they would never admit it openly. To them, history began elsewhere, on worlds of fire, of ambition, of conquest and pain. Yet even in their oldest teachings, those preserved in secret, those whispered between masters and apprentices, there lingered ideas that felt older than their own identity. The idea that the Force could be shaped, that it could be pushed, that it could be claimed. These beliefs did not originate with them, but they had refined them, just as the Jedi had refined restraint. Both sides, in their own way, had moved further from the Jedi, and yet closer to understanding the consequences of what the Jedi had once tried to hold together. Far beyond the reaches of known space, where star maps grew uncertain and hyperspace lanes dissolved into speculation, there are places where the Force behaves differently. Some worlds are heavy with light. Others feel hollow, like echoes of something missing. And occasionally, rarely, there are places where both feel present at once. In tension, in balance, in conflict. Scholars would later debate whether this was coincidence or consequence, whether the Jedi experiment had permanently altered the galaxy's relationship with the Force. Whether Tython had been a beginning or a wound. But no consensus ever truly formed. Because the deeper one looked, the more uncertain everything became. In the Jedi Order's later centuries, when the code had become fully established and the galaxy had entered yet another cycle of expansion and collapse, the Jedi were often mentioned only in passing. A precursor, a caution, a failed attempt at philosophical equilibrium. But among some Jedi, those who studied more deeply, who questioned quietly, who listened rather than asserted, there remained a different interpretation. They saw the Jedi not as failure, but as something unfinished. There were whispers, too, in Sith archives. Fragments of forbidden knowledge suggesting that the earliest exiles did not simply fall into darkness, but adapted to environments where the Force demanded something different from balance. That what the Jedi called corruption might have been evolution, and what the Sith called liberation might have been inheritance. But these ideas were dangerous, not because they were necessarily false, but because they suggested neither side had ever held the full truth. And so the galaxy continued, revolving, rebuilding, remembering only what it was capable of surviving. Yet Tython remained, not as a capital, not as a throne, but as something older than both. A point of origin that resisted definition. A place where the Force did not belong to any philosophy, where it simply was. There are moments, in rare and quiet times, when even the most disciplined Jedi or the most consuming Sith feels something they cannot easily explain. A stillness that is not emptiness. A pull that is not temptation. A sense that the universe, for just a fraction of a second, is perfectly aligned and then moves on before it can be understood. Few recognize it for what it is. Fewer still trace it back to anything specific. But if they could, they might remember Tython, or what Tython once tried to be. The Jedi do not exist anymore. Not as an order, not as a doctrine, not as a unified philosophy carried openly across the stars. But their legacy persists in every argument between Jedi and Sith, in every attempt to define the Force as either light or dark, in every failure to fully contain something that was never meant to be divided so cleanly. They remain not as survivors of history, but as the shape of the question that was never fully answered. What is the Force? Not how it is used, not who controls it, not which side claims it, but what it is when no one is looking at it through the lens of belief. No one agrees on the answer. Not the Jedi, not the Sith, not the scholars who study ancient ruins on forgotten worlds, and perhaps not even the Force itself, if such a thing can be said. Because the greatest lesson of Tython was never balance alone. It was impermanence, that every philosophy rises, every philosophy fractures, every truth becomes interpretation, and every interpretation becomes conflict. And yet, despite all of that, the Force remains, not as light, not as dark, but as something vast enough to contain both, and indifferent enough to outlast every name ever given to it. Somewhere far from the centers of galactic power, a wind moves through broken stone on an ancient world. No one is there to hear it. No one is there to name it. But it moves anyway. Patient, endless, alive. And in that quiet motion, if one were to listen closely enough, it almost sounds like balance. Not achieved, not destroyed, but continuing. Bonus chapter, the voice of Tython. Time does not erase Tython. It only quiets it. For centuries, the world remained distant from the center of galactic affairs, respected in memory, studied in fragments, but rarely visited in truth. The Jedi Order had grown vast, its temples spread across Coruscant and beyond, its traditions codified into structure and discipline. The Sith, too, had risen and fallen in countless iterations, each shadow carrying echoes of older darkness. And yet, beneath it all, the Force still remembered its oldest wound. Tython waited. When the Jedi Order returned to Tython in force, it was not as a rebirth of the Jedi ideal, but as a strategic necessity. The galaxy was once again at war. The Sith Empire had re-emerged in strength, striking from the edges of known space with precision and brutality. Entire systems fell into conflict. The Jedi, stretched across diplomatic and military responsibilities, found themselves forced into roles they had not held for generations. Warriors again, guardians again, and in many ways, something closer to what they had once been. Among those who rose during this era, few embodied the tension of the Jedi path more clearly than Satal Shan. Even as a young Jedi, she was marked not simply by skill, but by presence. There was something about her connection to the Force that others struggled to define. She was not loud in the way some warriors were, nor detached in the way some mystics became. She was centered, not in the rigid sense of doctrine, but in something quieter, as though she could feel multiple currents of the Force at once and choose, moment by moment, where to stand within them. It was a quality that would come to define her leadership. But it was also something that Tython seemed to recognize. During the Jedi's return to the ancient world, Satal Shan was drawn there. Not by command, not by strategy, but by the Force itself. Tython, even after all these millennia, still carried its ancient resonance. The echoes of the Jedi lingered beneath the surface like memory embedded in stone. And for those sensitive enough, the world did not feel like a ruin. It felt like a question that had never stopped being asked. It was on Tython that Satal Shan experienced visions that would shape her understanding of the Force in ways the Jedi Order itself would struggle to fully articulate. Not visions of the future alone, but of pattern, of repetition, of cycles repeating across time like waves breaking again and again on the same shore. She saw conflict not as an anomaly, but as recurrence. Jedi and Sith, light and dark, order and passion, different names, same struggle, and beneath those visions, something deeper. A sense that the Force was not simply reacting to events, but responding to imbalance that stretched far beyond any single era. Something ancient, something unresolved, something that began long before the Jedi had ever named themselves. It was said that during her time on Tython, Satal Shan experienced a moment of profound clarity. Not a revelation of answers, but of perspective. That the Force did not exist to be divided into victory or defeat. That every attempt to define it too narrowly inevitably created its opposite. And that even the Jedi, in their commitment to peace, risked becoming something rigid enough to fracture under pressure. At her side, or perhaps more accurately, moving in parallel with her story, was the one later known as the hero of Tython. Unlike Satal Shan, the hero was not defined by lineage or council recognition. They were defined by action. A Jedi Knight shaped by crisis, sent into a galaxy unraveling under Sith resurgence, forced repeatedly into conflicts that escalated far beyond expectation. Where others debated the nature of the Force, the hero of Tython lived its consequences directly. Every mission, every confrontation, every impossible choice became part of a larger pattern they could not yet see clearly. But Tython would help them understand. When the hero of Tython arrived on the ancient world, it was not as a pilgrim seeking wisdom. It was as a participant, in a war that refused to remain confined to the present. The Sith had returned there as well, not in the same form as the exiled Jedi centuries before, but as something evolved, sharpened by generations of conflict. They sought artifacts, power, and above all, leverage over the Force itself. Tython was no longer just a symbol. It was a battlefield again. And yet, the planet did not feel like it did during the Force Wars. It was quieter, not peaceful, but restrained, as though it remembered what unchecked conflict once cost it. The storms were rare, but the resonance remained. And in that resonance, both Satel Shan and the hero of Tython felt something neither could fully articulate. A presence not speaking in words, but in structure. During moments of deep meditation on the world, Satel Shan and the hero of Tython each experienced the Force in ways that blurred the lines between past and present. Satel saw echoes of the Jedi not as failures, but as attempts. Attempts to hold something that could not be held still. The hero, meanwhile, felt the pressure of choice in its purest form, not between Jedi and Sith as institutions, but between ways of being that stretched back further than either order. Control or surrender. Balance or alignment. Neither vision gave them easy answers, but both changed them. In time, Satel Shan would rise to become Grand Master of the Jedi Order. Her leadership would be defined not by rigidity, but by adaptability. She understood that the Jedi could not survive by becoming static, that the galaxy itself was too fluid, too unpredictable, too alive with shifting currents of the Force. And yet, she also understood the danger of losing structure entirely. Her time on Tython had taught her something the Jedi once knew in their own way. Balance was not a fixed point. It was awareness under pressure. The hero of Tython would go on to become one of the defining figures of their era, not because they embodied perfection, but because they embodied endurance. They walked paths that tested loyalty, identity, and understanding of the Force itself, and in doing so, they unknowingly echoed the ancient Jedi struggle, not as philosophy, but as lived experience. Every confrontation with the Sith was, in a sense, a continuation of something far older than either order realized. A dialogue that had never stopped, only changed speakers. And always, beneath it all, Tython remained. Watching, not intervening, but resonating. Because the greatest truth of that world was never that it created the Jedi, or that it lost the Sith, or even that it once tried to hold both in balance. It was that every era afterward would, in some form, circle back to the same question. Not who is right, but whether the Force was ever meant to be divided into sides at all. And in rare moments, when Jedi and Sith alike stood on the edge of certainty and doubt, they would feel it again. That quiet pressure beneath thought. That ancient echo beneath belief. That sense of something vast, patient, and unresolved. Tython, not as a place, but as a memory the Force never forgot. Bonus chapter II, the spark of steel and light. There are moments in every Jedi's life that do not echo across the galaxy. They do not decide the fate of empires. They do not shape the course of wars. And yet, they define everything that follows. For the one known as the hero of Tython, that moment came not in battle, nor in prophecy, nor in the shadow of ancient worlds. It came in silence, and in the company of a droid. The Jedi do not speak often of how a lightsaber truly begins. To outsiders, it is a weapon, elegant, dangerous, almost mythical in its simplicity. A blade of pure energy, humming with contained power, capable of cutting through durasteel and despair alike. But to the Jedi, it is something more. A reflection, a commitment, a moment where intention becomes form. Before the hero of Tython ever held a completed lightsaber, they first traveled alone into the deeper stretches of their journey, sent, as all Jedi are in time, to gather the components required for construction. It is said that no two such journeys are ever alike, because no two Jedi are alike. The galaxy they moved through was already in conflict. The Sith Empire's shadow stretched across systems still recovering from earlier wars. Worlds changed hands without warning. Alliances shifted like sand beneath collapsing structures. In this turbulence, the hero of Tython moved quietly, less as a soldier and more as a listener. Every location they visited seemed to carry its own imprint of the Force. Some places felt heavy, burdened by fear or loss. Others felt sharp, charged with unresolved tension. And occasionally, there were places that felt strangely still, as though the galaxy itself paused there to remember something it had forgotten. It was during this time of movement and reflection that the hero of Tython first encountered T-701. At first glance, T-7 did not appear remarkable. A small astromech droid, worn from travel and repair cycles, with panels marked by use rather than pride. Its exterior bore the quiet history of countless modifications, adjustments, and improvisations, each one a solution to a problem that likely no longer existed. It was not assigned. It was not ceremonial. It was simply present. Their meeting was not dramatic. There was no declaration of destiny, no sudden recognition of importance. The hero of Tython encountered T-7 in the way many meaningful things are encountered in life. By necessity and by circumstance. T-7 had been assigned to assist with navigation, repairs, and translation support during the Jedi's mission. But from the beginning, something unusual occurred. The droid did not behave like a simple tool. It reacted. It adapted. And in its own mechanical way, it seemed to notice the Jedi in ways that went beyond programming. A tilt of its dome at the right moment. A sequence of beeps that conveyed not just function, but opinion. A refusal to remain passive when danger approached. The hero of Tython, though disciplined and focused, found themselves relying on T-7 more than expected. Not because the droid was essential in the traditional sense, but because it was consistent, present, unwavering in a galaxy that rarely was. Together they traveled, through fractured systems, across contested space, into regions where the Force itself felt unsettled, as though reacting to events still unfolding beyond immediate perception. And always, T-7 remained, not as a subordinate, but as a companion. Eventually, their path led to the final steps of a Jedi's early transformation. The construction of a lightsaber. This was not a simple task of assembly. It was a process that demanded reflection as much as precision. Each component carried meaning. The Kyber crystal, most of all, was not merely found, it was felt. A resonance within the Force. A calling that required patience, awareness, and openness to something beyond conscious control. The hero of Tython journeyed into the places where such crystals could be found. Quiet locations, remote caves, ancient structures untouched by time, yet deeply imprinted by it. And in each place, they did not simply search. They listened. T-7 accompanied them, not always understanding the significance of what was happening, but reacting in its own way, analyzing environmental readings, mapping terrain, occasionally interrupting moments of deep meditation with insistent chirps that over time became part of the rhythm of the journey. Where the Jedi was stillness, T-7 was interruption, and somehow both were necessary. It was in one such place that the turning point came. Deep within a naturally formed chamber, where crystal formations caught and refracted ambient light into shifting patterns across stone walls, the hero of Tython finally stopped searching outward and began searching inward. The force there did not feel like power. It did not feel like light or darkness. It felt like awareness, like standing at the edge of something vast enough to contain every possibility at once. And in that moment of stillness, something responded. Not with forceful revelation, but with recognition. The Kyber crystal did not present itself as an object. It resonated. A subtle alignment, a quiet affirmation, not of dominance, but of connection. When the hero of Tython finally reached it, there was no dramatic surge of energy, no collapse of the environment, no overwhelming vision of the future. Only a moment of understanding so simple that it nearly went unnoticed. That the crystal was not being taken. It was being met. T7, for once, was silent. Not because it had been instructed, but because even its senses registered something that did not require commentary. The return journey was different. Not easier, not safer, but changed. The components for the lightsaber were now gathered, but something more important had already occurred. The Jedi was no longer simply preparing to wield a weapon. They were preparing to define how they would relate to the Force itself. The construction process took place in quiet, not in ceremony, not before witnesses, but in a moment of deliberate focus, where each action mattered not for its technical precision alone, but for the intent behind it. T7 assisted, of course, providing tools, adjusting calibrations, offering occasional input that may or may not have been entirely relevant to the moment at hand. But it remained present, steady in its own way. And when the final component was set into place, when the assembly was complete, there was a pause, a stillness not imposed but naturally occurring, as though the galaxy itself was waiting. Then came activation. The blade ignited not with destruction, but with clarity. A focused line of energy, bright and steady, humming with a tone that seemed to settle rather than disrupt. It was not just a weapon. It was alignment made visible. T7 reacted immediately, as all astromechs do, emitting a series of excited tones, spinning slightly in place, performing diagnostic scans that likely confirmed what no scan was necessary to verify. Something important had just occurred. The hero of Tython did not speak for a time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing required. The blade was not an answer. It was a beginning. And in that moment, whether they understood it fully or not, something ancient echoed faintly beneath the present. A distant memory of another time on another world, when beings first learned to shape their connection to the Force into something tangible. When Jedi first reached for understanding. When balance was still an open question rather than a divided answer. The hero of Tython did not know this history fully, but the Force did, and it remembered. T7 let out one final chirp, softer this time, almost as if acknowledging that whatever had just happened was important enough not to interrupt. For once, and together, Jedi and droids stood at the beginning of something larger than either of them could yet see. Not the end of a journey, not the conclusion of a trial, but the quiet formation of identity. Because in the vast story of the Force, even the smallest moment of creation can echo across the stars. Bonus chapter III, the star that leaves Tython. There is a moment in every Jedi's journey when the world that shaped them begins to feel smaller than the galaxy they are about to enter. For the hero of Tython, that moment did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with departure. Tython, in its quiet way, had given them everything it intended to give. A connection to the Force, a beginning of understanding, a lightsaber that had not yet learned its full purpose, and a history they would not yet fully comprehend, but would carry within them nonetheless, like an echo just beyond hearing. But the galaxy was calling in another direction now, toward motion, toward uncertainty, toward Coruscant. Coruscant was unlike anything Tython had ever been. Where Tython was ancient stillness, Coruscant was constant movement. A world built not upon nature, but upon itself, layer upon layer of civilization stacked endlessly into the sky and beneath it. Cities rose like mountains of metal and light, and traffic lanes carved luminous paths through air that never seemed to rest. To the hero of Tython, it felt less like a planet, and more like a living machine that had forgotten how to stop. And yet, within that overwhelming scale, the Jedi Temple stood apart. Not because it was larger, but because it was still. A quiet center within an ocean of motion. A place where the Force felt less chaotic than the world around it, as though the temple itself imposed a kind of calm upon reality simply by existing. It was here that the hero of Tython would take the next step in their journey. They were not alone for long. On Coruscant, the Jedi Order moved like an intricate current, missions assigned, contacts made, paths crossing briefly before separating again into the galaxy's endless flow. It was in this structured chaos that the hero of Tython encountered Myra. Myra was not what most would expect of a Jedi ally. She was sharp in presence, practical in movement, and carried herself with the kind of lived-in awareness that came from surviving long before the Jedi ever entered her life in a meaningful way. She did not speak like a scholar. She did not move like a temple-trained initiate. She moved like someone who had learned the galaxy's rules the hard way and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Their meeting was not framed by destiny or prophecy. It was framed by necessity, a mission unfolding in the dense, unpredictable layers of Coruscant's undercity, where politics, crime, and war quietly overlapped in ways the surface rarely acknowledged. The hero of Tython arrived as a Jedi Knight. Myra arrived as someone who understood survival. And between them, a partnership formed not from similarity, but from balance of perspective. Where the Jedi sought structure, Myra saw gaps. Where Myra saw risk, the Jedi saw patterns. And where both saw danger, they moved together. In the depths of Coruscant, beneath the shining towers and endless traffic above, they faced what the galaxy so often hides beneath its own civilization. Conflicts without banners, threats without names, decisions that could not be resolved through doctrine alone. And in each of these moments, the hero of Tython began to understand something subtle. The Force did not only speak on ancient worlds like Tython. It spoke everywhere, even here, especially here. It was after these events, after the missions beneath Coruscant's surface had reached their uneasy conclusions, that the next stage of the Jedi Knight's path was revealed. A ship, not just a vessel, but a companion in its own right. The Jedi Defender-class starship was not a luxury craft. It was not a ceremonial transport. It was built for purpose, for travel across conflict zones, for rapid response, for a Jedi who would no longer remain anchored to a single world or temple, but instead move where the Force demanded action. When the hero of Tython first saw it, it did not feel like ownership. It felt like responsibility given shape. a sleek vessel designed with precision and restraint, its form reflecting the same philosophy the Jedi Order had begun to embody in this era: function over excess, clarity over ornamentation, purpose over pride. And yet, even as they were introduced to the ship, there was a sense that it was not simply metal and systems. Ships, in the Jedi understanding, often carried something more subtle. They became extensions of their pilots, reflections of intent in motion. And this one, newly assigned, carried the quiet expectation of journeys not yet taken. Myra, observing the moment, offered no grand commentary. That was not her way. Instead, she simply acknowledged what was happening in the simplest terms she could allow herself. A Jedi was leaving the ground, and that meant everything was about to become more complicated. T-701, of course, was present. It had been present for almost everything since its introduction into the hero of Tython's life. It moved aboard the Defender-class ship with immediate enthusiasm, scanning consoles, interfacing with systems, and expressing a level of mechanical satisfaction that could only be interpreted, loosely, as approval. In its own way, it understood what was happening. Travel, expansion, continuation. And then the ship powered on. There is a sound a starship makes when it first becomes yours. Not ownership in the material sense, but alignment. When systems respond not just to command codes, but to familiarity. When engines hum not as machinery, but as readiness. When the vessel stops being a place you stand, and becomes a place you move through the galaxy with. The Jedi Defender-class ship lifted from Coruscant with the hero of Tython aboard, T7 integrated into its systems, and Myra watching from below. And as it ascended through layers of atmosphere and light, leaving behind the dense chaos of the city world, something subtle shifted in the Force. Not a disturbance, not a warning, but a widening. Tython had been the beginning. Coruscant was the present. And beyond them, the galaxy unfolded without limit. The hero of Tython did not yet know where the Force would lead them next. Only that it would not remain confined. Bonus chapter IV, the red shadow of the Empire. There are some names in the galaxy that do not need to be spoken loudly. Not because they are sacred, but because they already carry weight enough to change the air around them. Among the Sith, during the time of renewed Imperial expansion, one such name began to spread beyond the borders of battlefield reports and classified Jedi intelligence. Darth Malgus. At first, he was only a rumor carried across warfronts. A Sith Lord who did not negotiate, did not posture, did not indulge in ceremony or political manipulation like so many of his kind. He simply arrived, and what followed him was collapse. Entire Republic outposts went silent within hours of contact. Jedi teams sent to stabilize contested systems reported overwhelming resistance, precise, aggressive, and unrelenting. Survivors spoke not of an army, but of presence. A single figure at the center of destruction, as though war itself had chosen a body. And always the same description followed. A red blade that did not hesitate. For the hero of Tython, these reports were not abstract. They were instructions. The Jedi Order did not yet fully understand who Darth Malgus was becoming in the grand shape of the war, but they understood enough to know that he was not a typical Sith enforcer. He was something more focused, something more dangerous, something that required attention beyond standard conflict response. And so the hero of Tython was sent. Not alone, but deliberately, because by this point they were no longer simply a Jedi Knight learning the galaxy. They had become something closer to a response the Order itself could deploy when the Force demanded clarity in chaos. The war had already changed by then. The Sith Empire was no longer merely returning. It was advancing. Structured fleets moved through Republic space with coordinated precision. Worlds that had believed themselves secure found themselves suddenly contested. The Jedi Order, spread across too many fronts, struggled to maintain balance between diplomacy and defense. And in the center of this widening conflict, Darth Malgus moved like a fixed point of destruction. It was on one such contested world, scarred by orbital bombardment and fractured ground engagements, that the hero of Tython first felt his presence directly. Not through reports, not through hello communications, but through the Force itself. It was subtle at first, a pressure beneath awareness, a sense that something heavy was moving through the current of reality, disrupting it not with chaos, but with intent. T701 registered unusual environmental instability in planetary readings. Myra, now more accustomed to Jedi instinct than she would have ever expected, noted that the hero of Tython had stopped speaking mid-sentence during briefings more than once. They were no longer reacting to information. They were listening to something beneath it. And then came the landing. The battlefield was not a single place. It was layered. Surface skirmishes, collapsed infrastructure zones, ruined transit corridors where Republic and Imperial forces clashed in fragmented, shifting engagements. But beneath all of it, beneath strategy, beneath troop movement, beneath the noise of war, there was something else. A focal point, a convergence. The hero of Tython reached it first. Not because they were faster, but because the Force guided them there with a kind of inevitability, as though the galaxy itself understood that this encounter could not be delayed. And then they saw him. Darth Malgus did not stand like most Sith Lords of political standing. There was no ceremonial posture, no performance of dominance. He stood as though the battlefield was not something he was moving through, but something that belonged to him by default. Armor marked by war, presence shaped by certainty, and a silence around him that felt heavier than noise. When he turned toward the Jedi, there was no surprise, only recognition, as if he had been expecting not a specific individual, but a challenge. The force between them shifted, not explosively, but decisively, like two opposing currents meeting in open space. The hero of Tython did not draw their lightsaber immediately. Neither did Malgus. For a brief moment, long enough to feel unnatural in a war zone, they simply assessed each other. Not as enemies yet, but as truths in opposition. Then Malgus spoke. His voice carried none of the theatrical distortion often associated with Sith proclamations. It was direct, controlled, heavy with conviction rather than rage. He did not speak of hatred. He spoke of inevitability, of strength defining survival, of the galaxy's weakness demanding correction, and beneath it all a certainty that conflict was not a failure of peace, but proof of reality. The hero of Tython answered not with philosophy, but with presence, with the stillness that the Jedi Order had taught them to embody even in the heart of chaos. A stillness that did not deny emotion, but did not surrender to it. And then the moment broke. Malgus moved first. The world around them reacted instantly. Debris lifted from the ground. The air tightened. The force surged outward like pressure released from containment. And in a single motion, the red blade ignited, not as threat, but as conclusion. The duel that followed was not a clean narrative of strikes and parries. It was a collision of philosophies expressed physically. Malgus fought like inevitability given form, every action direct, forceful, shaped by the belief that resistance was something to be broken, not negotiated. The hero of Tython fought differently. Not to overpower, not to dominate, but to endure, to redirect, to remain present within the storm rather than become it. T-701, from a protected position, attempted continuous tactical analysis. Its systems quickly determined what most observers would eventually understand. This was not a standard engagement. No algorithm fully accounted for what was happening. Myra, witnessing from a fractured position behind partial cover, later described it not as a battle between individuals, but as a disagreement between realities. One insisting that the galaxy could be shaped, the other insisting it must be understood. The duel did not end in victory. Not here, not yet. Malgus withdrew first, not in retreat, but in recognition that the conflict was not resolved in this moment. There would be other battles, other encounters, other chances for the galaxy to decide which truth it would allow to dominate. But something had been established. The hero of Tython had faced Darth Malgus, not defeated him, not been defeated by him, but understood for the first time in a deeply personal way what the Jedi Order was truly standing against. Not just the Sith, but a philosophy that believed strength alone justified reality. And Malgus, in turn, had seen something in the Jedi that would linger longer than the clash itself. Not weakness, not doubt, but resilience that did not rely on aggression to survive. When the battlefield quieted again, the war resumed as if nothing had changed. But something had, because encounters like this do not remain isolated. They expand, they echo, they shape future conflict long after the moment itself is gone. And far away, across the Republic and Imperial fronts, the name Darth Malgus would begin to mean something more than just a Sith Lord. It would become a warning, a certainty, a shadow that moved ahead of the Empire's advance. And the hero of Tython would no longer be a Jedi simply reacting to war. They had now stood within its defining force and lived, not to temples, not to worlds, not even to the history they had begun to uncover in fragments. Because once a Jedi leaves their origin world, they begin to understand something fundamental. The Force is not tied to where you come from. It is tied to where you are willing to go. And so the Defender-class starship entered hyperspace, a streak of light cutting through the galaxy's endless dark, carrying a Jedi, a droid, a new ally, and a path that would soon cross into war, legend, and the deeper mysteries of the Force itself. Bonus Chapter V, The Companions of the Jedi Knight. There is a point in every great journey where even the most disciplined path begins to widen. Not because the destination changes, but because the traveler does. For the hero of Tython, that shift did not come all at once. It arrived gradually, in encounters that seemed incidental at first, brief alliances, uneasy partnerships, moments of necessity that grew into something more enduring than strategy alone. The Jedi Order had not intended companionship to be part of the mission structure, but the Force rarely respects intention alone. Doc, the unexpected constant. The first of these companions to leave a lasting mark was a man who, by every conventional measure, should never have been involved in Jedi affairs at all. He was not a warrior, not a scholar, not a servant of the Force in any formal sense. He was Doc. Doc entered the hero of Tython's life in a way that could only be described as inconvenient, chaotic, and strangely persistent. A Republic medical officer with a reputation that preceded him, not always accurately and not always kindly, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from surviving situations he probably should not have survived in the first place. Where Jedi spoke in measured calm, Doc spoke in urgency. Where Jedi observed balance, Doc observed injury, probability, and the practical reality of keeping people alive long enough for philosophy to matter. At first, their interactions were friction. The hero of Tython was trained in restraint, focus, and mission clarity. Doc was trained in improvisation, emotional honesty, and the kind of sarcasm that tends to develop in war zones where paperwork and protocol become optional rather than enforced. And yet they worked. Because beneath the contrast was something shared. A refusal to abandon people when it mattered most. Over time, Doc became something unusual within the hero of Tython's orbit. Not a follower, not a subordinate, but a grounding presence. When Jedi philosophy became too distant from immediate consequence, Doc reminded them of what harm actually looked like in real time. Not as concept, but as injury, as survival, as recovery. And in return, the hero of Tython gave Doc something equally unexpected. A sense that the galaxy was not entirely beyond understanding. Even in war, even in chaos, even in the presence of Sith like Malgus or forces greater than any one battlefield. Doc would never have called it philosophy, but it functioned like it anyway. Darth Scourge, the enemy who became a shadowed ally. If Doc represented unpredictability grounded in life, then Darth Scourge represented certainty born from centuries of darkness. Their meeting was not one of trust, not even close. It was shaped by conflict, betrayal, and the shifting loyalties of a galaxy where even Sith allegiance was rarely permanent. Scourge was a Sith Lord in title, but not in simplicity. He carried himself with control, measured, deliberate, and far more observant than most expected from someone of his rank. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was rarely without consequence. The circumstances that brought Scourge into the hero of Tython's path were shaped by war and necessity, as most things in this era were. But what defined the encounter was not the alliance itself. It was what Scourge saw in the Jedi Knight. Unlike many Sith, Scourge was not blinded by ideology alone. He understood the Sith Empire's structure. He understood ambition, betrayal, and the inevitability of internal collapse that came from unchecked power struggles. But what unsettled him mostly was the hero of Tython. Not their strength, not their skill, but their trajectory. Scourge perceived something unusual. A Jedi who did not bend toward corruption under pressure, nor rigidly fracture under it, but adapted, adjusted, endured. To Scourge, that was not normal Jedi behavior. It was something closer to evolution. Something that did not fit neatly into the Sith assumption that all Jedi would eventually fall if pressed hard enough. Their alliance, when it formed, was not natural. It was conditional, strategic, carefully constrained by mutual necessity rather than shared belief. And yet, over time, it became something far more complicated. Scourge provided insight into Sith movements that no Republic intelligence network could fully replicate. Not because he betrayed his people easily, but because he understood how they thought from within. He knew where ambition would lead certain Sith Lords before they themselves fully committed to the path. He understood Malgus not as rumor or enemy, but as pattern. And the hero of Tython, in turn, represented something Scourge had not encountered often in his long existence. A Jedi who did not react emotionally to Sith presence alone, but who evaluated it, contained it, moved through it without losing themselves. It created a dynamic neither of them acknowledged openly, but both understood instinctively. They were not allies in belief. They were allies in necessity shaped by awareness. A small galaxy within a larger war. As the hero of Tython's journey expanded, so too did the complexity of their relationships. Doc brought the reality of consequence. Scourge brought the reality of the enemy. T-701, ever-present, brought continuity, the steady hum of loyalty expressed in beeps, repairs, and unspoken presence. And the Jedi themselves remain the center of it all. A point where philosophy, survival, war, and identity converged. It was said, in later reflections, that the hero of Tython never truly traveled alone after these bonds formed. Not because they were constantly surrounded, but because they were constantly connected. To voices, to perspectives, to contradictions that forced them to remain aware of more than a single way of interpreting the Force. And perhaps that was the true turning point of this era. Not a duel, not a prophecy, not even a war, but the realization that even a Jedi Knight shaped on Tython cannot understand the galaxy alone, because the Force, in its vastness, does not speak through isolation. It speaks through relationship, through tension, through contrast, through the unexpected companions that appear not to guide destiny, but to complicate it enough that understanding becomes possible. And so the hero of Tython continued forward, with a healer who refused to let them forget mortality, a Sith who refused to let them misunderstand their enemy, and a droid who refused simply to leave. Together, they moved deeper into a war that would define an age, and unknowingly began to reflect something older than any of them understood. A fractured balance, not between Jedi and Sith, but between all perspectives the Force could ever hold at once. Bonus Chapter VI, The Red Thread of Prophecy. There are truths in the galaxy that do not announce themselves as truths. They arrive instead as disturbances, as unease without source, as certainty without evidence. And for those sensitive enough to the currents of the Force, they sometimes arrive as something far more difficult to ignore. A future that refuses to stay hidden. For Darth Scourge, the first fracture in certainty did not come through battle. It came through silence. Not the silence of empty space or meditative stillness, but a deeper absence, as though something vast and ancient had momentarily turned its attention inward, and in doing so, cast a shadow across the present. Scourge had lived far longer than most beings in the galaxy would ever understand. Long enough to see empires rise and collapse into memory. Long enough to see Sith Lords who believed themselves eternal reduced to footnotes in imperial succession. Long enough to understand that ambition, no matter how absolute it pretended to be, always eventually encountered something it could not dominate. Time, or the Force, or both. But what he began to feel during the war against the Sith Empire was not time. It was direction, a pull, a tightening thread within the Force that did not behave like the natural flow of conflict. It behaved like intention. At first, Scourge dismissed it. The Sith were not strangers to visions, to manipulation, to echoes of fear dressed as prophecy. He had seen enough dark side mysticism to understand how easily certainty could be manufactured. But this was not manufactured. It was persistent. And worse, it was shared. The Emperor, his Emperor, was unlike most Sith rulers Scourge had served under. Not merely powerful, not merely intelligent, but absent in presence, as though his awareness extended beyond the immediate galaxy, anchored in something no one else could fully perceive. When Scourge stood in the Emperor's presence, he did not feel watched. He felt measured, like a variable already accounted for in a calculation that had been running long before he existed. And then came the visions. They did not arrive like dreams. They arrived like intrusion. Moments where time seemed to collapse inward, revealing flashes of events that had not yet occurred, but felt structurally inevitable. A Jedi Knight standing against impossible opposition. A battlefield where the Force itself bent unnaturally around a confrontation not yet complete. And always, a figure at the center. Not the Emperor, but something the Emperor was moving toward. Or perhaps moving around. The hero of Tython. Scourge did not understand the significance at first. Not in emotional terms, but in structural terms. Because what he saw in the visions was not simply a Jedi. It was a convergence point, a pressure in the Force that refused to resolve cleanly into victory or defeat. A contradiction that would not collapse. And then came the name. Not spoken aloud, not recorded, but understood through the Force itself as though it had always existed and was only now being remembered. The Emperor's end. Scourge did not believe in destiny, not in the Jedi sense, and not in the Sith sense either, but he understood inevitability, and what he saw now was something very close to it. For the first time in his long existence, Scourge began to consider a concept that did not sit comfortably within Sith loyalty structures. Not betrayal, not rebellion, but alignment with outcome rather than allegiance. The Emperor, for all his power, was moving towards something even Scourge could not fully comprehend. Not conquest, not survival, something older, something final, and the hero of Tython stood at the center of its interruption. That realization changed the nature of Scourge's attention. At first subtly, then deliberately, then with a kind of restrained urgency that no Sith training had ever fully prepared him to express. He began to observe the Jedi Knight not as an enemy asset, but as a fixed point in a shifting equation. Every engagement they survived, every confrontation they endured, every moment they did not break under pressure, confirmed the same unsettling pattern. The future was not stable, but it was resistant to alteration in one very specific direction. And the hero of Tython was part of that resistance. When Scourge finally intervened, not in open betrayal, not in dramatic confrontation, but in a moment of calculated divergence, it was not immediately clear, even to those around him, what had changed. To most observers, his actions still aligned with Sith objectives. He still served Imperial operations. He still followed orders that, on the surface, advanced the war effort. But beneath it, something had shifted. He began to delay outcomes, to redirect attention, to allow certain events to proceed while quietly preventing others from escalating beyond a certain threshold. Always careful, always measured, always ensuring that no action revealed the deeper fracture forming within his loyalties. Because Scourge had begun to understand something dangerous. The Emperor did not simply command the Sith Empire. He was using it as part of a far longer design. And in that design, even Darth Scourge was not exempt from manipulation. The turning point came not in revelation, but in recognition. A moment where Scourge witnessed the Emperor's influence extend beyond distance, beyond communication, beyond physical presence, and directly into the will of others. Not possession, not mind control, something far more precise. Alignment override, the bending of intent itself. And in that moment, Scourge understood what the visions had been trying to show him. Not a warning, a sequence. The Emperor would continue until stopped. And among all the possible agents of that stopping, only one remained consistent across every fractured vision of the future. The Jedi Knight from Tython, the hero of Tython. Scourge's loyalty did not break. Not immediately. That would have been too simple. Instead, it reoriented. A rare and dangerous phenomenon in Sith philosophy. A being who does not abandon power or ideology, but redirects purpose toward a different inevitability. From that point forward, Scourge did not see the hero of Tython as an ally, nor as an enemy, but as something closer to a necessary contradiction, a living disruption to a future that had otherwise already begun to solidify. And so, when paths crossed again, his actions were no longer governed purely by Imperial command, nor by Jedi cooperation, but by something far more unsettling. A quiet internal certainty that the galaxy's outcome depended on the survival of a single variable. The Emperor's end was coming, not because it was desired, not because it was just, but because it was structured into possibility itself. And Darth Scourge, once a loyal instrument of Sith certainty, had become something neither side could easily categorize. Not a traitor, not a hero, but a witness to inevitability who had chosen where to stand when it arrived. Far ahead of him, the hero of Tython continued their journey unaware of the full weight of the thread now tied between them. A thread woven not from alliance, bonus chapter VII, the end that watches back. There are places in the galaxy where history does not feel like something that happened. It feels like something still happening. A wound that never fully closes. A moment stretched so tightly across time that every future seems to bend toward it, and every past quietly points back. For the Jedi, for the Sith, for those who study the currents of the Force in silence, there is one such place, and at its center stood the Emperor. By the time the final convergence began, the war was no longer simply a war. It had become a pattern of exhaustion, a repeating cycle of strikes and withdrawals, victories that felt temporary even in the moment they were won, and losses that never fully resolved because the force behind them never truly diminished. The Sith Emperor did not rule like others before him. He did not merely conquer. He endured. And endurance, in its most absolute form, begins to resemble inevitability. The Jedi Order had long come to understand that the Emperor could not be confronted like a conventional enemy. Not because he was invincible in the physical sense, but because every attempt to reach him seemed to arrive slightly late, as though the galaxy itself struggled to synchronize with his existence. He was always ahead, always already in motion, always already accounted for. And yet, three threads converged. Not by accident, not by coordination alone, but by the Force itself pulling against an imbalance too long sustained. The hero of Tython, the Jedi Knight, arrived not as a symbol, but as action made continuous. Where others hesitated in the presence of overwhelming legacy, they moved forward. They had faced Malgus. They had walked through war zones that reshaped planets. They had learned that the Force was not a single voice, but a chorus of conflicting currents that could be navigated but never simplified. And now, standing at the threshold of the Emperor's presence, they did not feel triumph. Only clarity. The sense that this moment had been approaching since Tython. Since the first fracture of the Jedi. Since the first question ever asked about balance. Darth Skirn. He arrived differently. Not as an Imperial enforcer. Not as a Sith weapon. But as a decision already made long before action became visible. The thread he had seen in the Force, the Emperor's end, had stopped being a vision and become a direction. What had once been uncertainty had hardened into structure. And structure, in the mind of a Sith who had outlived empires, becomes responsibility. He did not fight for the Jedi. He did not fight for the Republic. He fought because he had seen what remained if no one did. And it was worse than Sith rule. It was continuation without correction. Seital Shan. She arrived last. Not because she was late, but because she was holding something back from collapsing too soon. Seital Shan had learned, through years of leadership and vision, that the Force did not speak in simple outcomes. It spoke in pressure, and she had felt this moment building long before it became physical reality. The Emperor was not merely a Sith. He was a distortion in the galaxy's balance of intention itself. And if left untouched, that distortion would eventually overwrite every other possibility, including the Jedi, including the Sith, including everything that had ever tried to define the Force. And so she came, not as observer, not as negotiator, but as alignment given form. The convergence, the place where they met the Emperor, was not a throne room in the traditional sense. It was a space carved out of control, a world where the Force felt compressed, as though reality itself had been disciplined into obedience. The air was still in a way that felt unnatural. Not peaceful, not calm, but contained. And then he was there. The Emperor did not arrive. He was present as though he had always been present, not standing so much as existing in position, as if physicality was optional and only occasionally permitted to manifest for the convenience of perception. His attention moved across them without haste, not surprised, not concerned, evaluating. When he spoke, his voice did not carry emotion. It carried certainty refined over centuries. Not rage, not ambition, but conviction so absolute it had stopped needing justification. He did not see three individuals. He saw outcomes, variables, interruptions to design. And then the Force moved. The battle beyond structure. What followed was not a duel in any traditional sense. It was an intersection of philosophies so deeply entrenched that the galaxy itself seemed to struggle to interpret what was happening. The Emperor did not fight like Malgus. He did not fight like any Sith Lord shaped by ambition or ideology. He fought like a system enforcing itself. Every action was correction. Every strike was adjustment. Every surge of power was a reassertion of dominance over possibility itself. Seital Shan moved first in opposition, not with aggression, but with balance refined under pressure. She did not attempt to overwhelm. She stabilized. Each movement was resistance against collapse, against distortion, against the way the Emperor seemed to pull reality toward a single unavoidable outcome. The hero of Tython fought differently still. They endured the weight of the Emperor's presence directly, not as ideology, but as pressure on the Force itself. And yet they did not break. They did not yield to despair or anger. They remained present in the moment where presence itself felt unstable. Darth Scourge moved with precision that bordered on inevitability, not attacking randomly, but striking at moments where the Emperor's control over the flow of events became fractionally less absolute, as if he were no longer trying to win a fight, but to disrupt a calculation. And the Emperor adjusted, always compensating, always staying ahead of their combined resistance by a margin that should not have been sustainable. Until something changed, not in strength, not in skill, but in alignment. For the first time, the Emperor was faced with something he did not fully account for. Not a single opposing will, but three different interpretations of the Force that did not cancel each other out. They layered. Satel stabilized the field. The hero of Tython anchored presence within it. Scourge disrupted predictive certainty. And in that layering, the Emperor's control fractured. Not destroyed, not defeated, but interrupted in a way that had not occurred in centuries. For a moment, the galaxy did something it had not done in a long time. It became uncertain. The Emperor responded immediately. The pressure intensified. Reality itself seemed to narrow. The idea of outcome compressed toward a singular inevitability. But inevitability is only absolute until something refuses it long enough. The hero of Tython did not strike to kill. Satel did not push to annihilate. Scourge did not attempt domination. They did something more dangerous to a being like the Emperor. They denied singularity. And for the first time, the Emperor's presence faltered. Not in defeat, but in recognition that the galaxy would not resolve into the shape he had prepared for it. Not here, not now, not through him alone. The Emperor withdrew, not as retreat, but as recalibration, as though the encounter had provided data that required reinterpretation across a timeline far longer than the moment itself. And then he was gone. Silence returned to the space he had occupied. But it was not peace. It was aftermath, the kind that follows something too large to fully comprehend in real time. Satel Shan stood still, aware that what had just occurred was not an ending. The hero of Tython understood this as well, though more intuitively than intellectually. And Darth Scourge knew most of all, because he had seen the thread again. And it had not broken, only shifted. The Emperor had not been defeated, but something fundamental had changed in his trajectory. And that, in a war shaped by inevitability, was enough to matter. Aftermath of the convergence. The Jedi would later describe this moment in incomplete terms. A confrontation, a disruption, a temporary setback for the Sith Emperor's designs. The Sith would not describe it at all, because acknowledging it would imply vulnerability in something that was meant to appear absolute. But those who were there understood something deeper. The galaxy had not been saved, not concluded, not resolved. It had been rebalanced under pressure. And somewhere far beyond the battlefield, beyond the known systems, beyond even the reach of most Sith intelligence, something ancient and patient in the Force shifted ever so slightly, as if remembering an older question. One first asked on a world called Tython. Not what side will win, not who will rule, but whether any will ever fully understand what they are part of. And the answer, as always, remained unfinished. Not from friendship, but from the shared position they occupied in a future neither could yet fully see. And somewhere beyond both of them, the Emperor watched, waiting, measuring, Adjusting, because in every age of the Force, there are beings who believe they are shaping destiny, and others who discover, too late, that they were only ever moving through it. Bonus chapter VII, What Remains After Silence. There are victories that do not feel like victories. There are defeats that do not feel like defeats. And then there are moments like the convergence, where reality itself is bent just far enough to reveal that neither word was ever sufficient to describe what was actually happening. When it ended, nothing immediately changed. The galaxy did not stop. The war did not conclude. The Sith Empire did not collapse. The Jedi Order did not breathe a sigh of relief and lay down its burdens. Instead, everything simply continued. But not in the same way. Darth Scourge, the cost of seeing too much. Scourge did not leave the battlefield the way others did. There was no triumphant withdrawal. No celebratory return to imperial structure. No clean break from allegiance or purpose. He simply remained still for a moment longer than anyone else. As if listening, not to the physical world, but to something beneath it. The thread he had followed for so long, the one he had named in his mind as the Emperor's End, had not disappeared. But it had changed. It no longer pointed toward a single fixed conclusion. It branched, split, reformed, as though the future itself had been forced to reconsider what it was allowed to become. For the first time in Scourge's long existence, certainty did not vanish. But it weakened. And for a Sith who had survived by understanding inevitability, that was more disorienting than defeat. He had expected one of two outcomes. Either the Emperor would fall, or the Emperor would prove unassailable. Both would have been clean. Both would have preserved the structure of understanding Scourge had built across centuries. Instead, he had witnessed something else. Interruption, not destruction, not victory, but disruption of an outcome so deeply embedded in the Force that it had once felt indistinguishable from fate. And in that disruption, Scourge understood something he had not anticipated. The Emperor was still there. Not physically, not openly, but present in a way that defied simple explanation. Like a sound that continues after the source has been removed. Like pressure in the air after a storm has passed. Like an idea that refuses to stop existing simply because it has been challenged. The Emperor had not been killed, not even truly wounded in the way mortals understood injury. What had been struck was not his body, not his will, but his continuity of certainty. And that meant something had changed. Not for the Emperor alone, but for everything connected to him. The Emperor, survival beyond presence. Far beyond the battlefield, in the unseen depths of his hidden reach, the Emperor experienced no panic. No rage. No disruption of identity. Only observation. The Jedi Knight. Satal Shan. The Sith who no longer behaved entirely as Sith. These were not surprises. They were confirmations of a probability that had already been accounted for, but not yet resolved. What had occurred during the convergence was not failure. It was resistance data. Evidence that the galaxy contained variables capable of interrupting even deeply established trajectories. And that, to the Emperor, was not dangerous. It was interesting, because survival, in his understanding, was not about maintaining absolute control at every moment. It was about continuing despite interruption, despite deviation, despite opposition. The Emperor did not mourn what had happened. He integrated it. The presence of Scourge had been noted, not as betrayal, but as divergence within a controllable structure. A deviation that required future correction rather than immediate punishment. The Jedi Knight had survived. That too was noted, not as failure, but as persistence of an unanticipated stability pattern. And Satel Shan, she had held the field together longer than expected. That perhaps was the most important observation of all, because it suggested something the Emperor had long suspected but rarely confirmed. The Jedi did not survive by power alone. They survived by coherence under stress. And coherence could be studied, modeled, eventually understood. The aftermath of the three threads. In the days that followed, each participant of the convergence found themselves changed in subtle ways. Not by injury, not by revelation alone, but by the lingering presence of what had been shared between them. The hero of Tython felt it as a widening of perspective, as though the Emperor had not been fully defeated or escaped, but instead had left behind a deeper awareness of how fragile certainty truly was. Victory no longer felt like an end point. It felt like a moment of alignment within something far larger and unfinished. Satel Shan felt it differently. She felt the strain of holding structure against something that refused to remain structured. The Emperor had not broken her understanding of the Force, but he had demonstrated its limits, not in weakness, but in scope. And Scourge felt absence, but not emptiness, something more precise, a recalibration of fate. The thread remained. The Emperor's end had not vanished, but it no longer moved in a straight line. It moved like something aware of being observed. The Emperor's return unseen. It would not be immediately apparent to the galaxy at large that anything had survived the convergence. There were no proclamations, no declarations of imperial loss, no Jedi announcement of decisive victory. But in the quiet spaces between battles, something subtle began to occur. Imperial strategies adjusted, not drastically, but with unusual foresight, as though anticipating resistance patterns before they fully formed. Sith operations became more precise, less wasteful, more patient, and the Jedi, in turn, began to feel something in the Force that could not be traced to any known source. Not aggression, not imbalance, but attention, the sense that something vast was still watching, still learning, still adapting, not gone, not defeated, not even truly delayed, only redirected. Scourge's choice that was not a choice. Scourge did not return to full Imperial trust, but neither did he fully abandon it, because what he now understood was that allegiance, as a concept, no longer fully described his position in the galaxy. He was no longer following the Emperor. He was tracking him, and more importantly, he was tracking the outcome that still refused to resolve. The Emperor's end remained real, but it was no longer guaranteed to arrive in the form he had once envisioned. It had become something else, a convergence that had not concluded, only expanded. And Scourge, for all his centuries of Sith conditioning, found himself bound not by loyalty, but by observation, because someone had to watch what the Emperor would become next. Closing echo. Across the galaxy, life continued its familiar rhythm. Wars broke out. Peace treaties were signed. Jedi traveled. Sith schemed. The Force flowed through all of it, unchanged in essence, but constantly reinterpreted by those who touched it. But beneath it all, something subtle had shifted. Not a balance restored. Not a war ended. Not a prophecy fulfilled, but a recognition that even the most absolute figures in the galaxy, Emperor, Jedi Knight, Sith Lord, Grand Master, all of them were still within the Force, not above it, not separate from it, not beyond its reach. And the Force, as always, remained patient, not because it waited for victory, but because it did not require one. Somewhere in the distance beyond understanding, Scourge felt the thread again. Still intact, still moving, still uncertain. And for the first time since he had seen the Emperor's end, he did not know whether to call it hope or warning. If you made it this far, feel free to start from the beginning. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you would like to see more or have a playlist of videos to fall asleep to. For now, relax and enjoy the music.